Ele é editor do blog Live Journal sobre teoria política e filosofia. Ele é fundador e presidente do Seasteading Institute, que é uma entidade sem fins lucrativos, que tem como missão justamente promover o desenvolvimento de comunidades autônomas permanentes no oceano. Por favor, aplaudam aí o Patri Friedman.
Thank you. All right, well, this is going to be a bit of a different talk, but that's good, right? Because diversity reduces risk. So whether or not I manage to convince you that floating cities are the best way to increase freedom, which may be kind of hard, I hope to at least convince you that the freedom movement is overinvested in academics rather than entrepreneurship and in arguing with people rather than showing them examples. So that's what I'll try to do. All right, so what's the structure of this talk going to be? First, I'll kind of explain the basic premise of seasteading, mostly without referring to libertarianism, because it's an idea that works for everyone. It's an idea that appeals even beyond libertarians. And then I'll talk about some of the implications for libertarians, about kind of the contrast between the approach of complaining about government and the approach of trying to compete with it, and why I think my way is better. Big surprise. And then I'm going to talk about the organization I founded, the Seasteading Institute, because ideas matter, but ideas alone are not enough. We need to put ideas into practice, and I'll talk about the concrete steps that we're trying to do that. What I won't talk about very much is morality or the morality of government or political parties. Instead, I kind of view government as a product where citizens are customers, they pay taxes, they get certain services in return for their taxes, not usually very good ones, but some. Or alternately, I view government as a technology. So it's a set of rules and processes. I mean, what is a set of laws but a list of instructions for how to decide who's right or wrong in a legal case, or what you're going to do in a certain circumstance? And a set of rules or instructions is basically a technology. All right, so why take this approach? What I'm trying to do is to get us to think about politics with our rational brains, our uniquely human higher thinking skills, rather than with our limbic system, center of emotion, or our reptilian brain, or even lower parts below the brain entirely. I think that our kind of tribal emotions get in the way of understanding what's really wrong with government, that we see everything as a battle of us against them. It's kind of trying to expand our movement until it's big enough to take over the tribe, and that's really not a useful way to think. Instead, I think that we should figure out the incentives of government and try to improve them. If you haven't seen this picture before, this is North Korea and South Korea at night. You'll notice one is a little brighter than the other. These two places didn't start with different types of people, with a different culture, or with different resources. They just chose very different government technologies. They chose very different systems of rules, and they got very different outcomes. And one of the things that's been happening in economics in a field called institutional economics is economists realizing that rules and institutions are really important in productivity and growth, maybe even the most important. Economists used to think it was about resources and accumulating capital. Instead, if you look at the statistical regressions, it looks like resources may even be a negative, because countries that have a lot of resources set up elites that try to control access to those resources and just kind of rent-seek. They just live off of the access, say, to the oil, whereas a country without resources has to create value in order to have value. So systems of rules matter a lot. And in fact, this is kind of non-intuitive, but they matter more than things like education or intelligence, which many of us intuit matter the most. If you move a worker from Mexico to the US, their productivity increases by about a factor of 5, much more than, say, the difference between a high school dropout and a PhD, or someone with an IQ of 100 versus an IQ of 130. So what system of rules we have and what system of rules people live under, it matters a lot to long-run growth. So Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other ones we've tried. And to some people, this is the end of the story. But I think it's the beginning. After all, most possible systems of government, most sets of rules, most legal systems, most constitutions have not been tried yet. If we imagine that this room was the space of all possible legal systems, every little point in this room represents some government, what have we tried? Maybe, I don't know, this much? Maybe a space the size of me? Very little. What's the chance that the best possible government has already been tried? It's almost zero. Another argument is, unless you think that there's some country which is better than all other countries at everything, unless that's true, which I don't think it is, then you should believe that if we took the best ideas from each country, the best parts of each constitution, we could make something better than anything that we have today. And finally, to argue that government can get better than it is now, I'll make the technological progress argument. So there's an old joke about the U.S. Constitution which says, you know, it's not great, but it's better than what America uses now. And I agree, but it's far from the best that we can do. I mean, what's the chance that in all of the advances in psychology and economics and computers that we've had since the U.S. Constitution was written, what's the chance that none of them affect what the best system of rules is? Basically, zero. And let me just give you a quick example to illustrate this. So many countries today use a representative democracy where you get together in elections every couple of years and you vote for representatives for a whole geographic region. What if instead anybody could pick the representative from anyone else, and you could change your representative based on the issue? Maybe you log into some website and you say, on these issues, I trust this think tank. On these issues, I trust this person. Or maybe on these issues, I want to vote myself. And every morning, the list of things comes up, and your computer tells you which things you need to vote on or which things you've already set a filter that will decide who votes. I think this system would be better than a democracy where you vote every couple of years because you get much better feedback. In the current system, a representative can give you one thing that you really want so that you vote for him, and then screw you over on everything else. In this system, they couldn't do that. Will the system work? I don't know. But it's an example of a system that's enabled by brand new technology that was not possible when most of the countries today were founded. So one thing, if government is a technology, there's something like really strange going on, right? Because we've come to expect something from our technologies, that they get better all the time. You know, how often do we throw out our cell phones nowadays? Every couple of years? How often do we throw out our computers? All right, how often do we throw out our governments? Really not very often. Why not? What's different about government that it doesn't just keep getting better and better, that we don't keep coming up with new ways for social organization? You know, some people will say, well, government isn't good because those guys in Congress are really bad, or we chose the wrong president, or we have the wrong monetary system. And I don't think that any of these are the answer. Not because they pick the wrong people to back or the wrong laws, but they're at entirely the wrong level. That is, that the questions we should be asking are not what is the best policy, but what systems tend to pick good policies, and how can we get in the real world systems that tend to generate good policies. The way that I view politics is sort of at three levels of emergent behavior, three levels of spontaneous order. One is policies, a specific rule like the minimum wage. Another is political systems like representative democracy or proximal democracy or monarchy or anarcho-capitalism. And at the highest level, what is the industry of all of the governments in the world as firms, and how do they compete for customers, and how do customers pick them? We tend to talk the most in politics about policies, about rules, about what should the minimum wage be or should we have one? What should the monetary system be? But I've come to think that this is just not very useful. That what matters is not what the best possible rule would be, but what rules do they pick in Brasilia? Are those the best possible rules? I think not. So which political systems we have really influences which rules we get. And I'm really glad that my dad's talking in a little bit, because he's going to talk about anarcho-capitalism and why we should expect to get better rules from it. And I'm going to briefly talk about democracy and why we should expect to get not so great rules from it. So I'll start with a little toy example. Raise your hand if you've heard of the hoteling model, one-dimensional model of voter preference. Not too many. Okay, this will be fun. I want 2 volunteers on stage. This will be quick. All right. Imagine that this stage is a one-dimensional axis of politics, left, right, say. And each of you are political candidates who can position yourself wherever you want on the stage. Now, voters are very simple. They will choose whoever is closest to their beliefs. So voters are spread out along this whole stage, and they'll just go vote for whoever's closest to them. I want you to stand so that you try to get the most voters. Right now, all these guys are with you. Those guys in the middle are kind of half with you. Oh, you're getting more. Now he's getting more than you. Now he's getting more than you. Oh, now he's getting more. You better do something. You better change. You can move around on the stage. Only sideways, not forward or back. You can move around. Okay, now it's closer to 50-50. You can go around him if you need to. Now it's closer. Okay, now it's about 50-50. Okay, good. Now what if either of you tried to move? Could you do better? If you went around him, oh, it'd still be about 50-50. Yeah. If you went around him, still, okay, good. You found it. Thank you. So what happened? That's a simple model called the hoteling model, which says that if you have a political system where people will vote for whoever's beliefs are closest to theirs, which kind of makes sense and can be modeled with one axis, that the parties will choose the median. The median, mathematically, is the place that splits all the voters in two. This was not designed. All right, here's what's important, is it wasn't like someone said, well, I think in a democracy, the political parties should position themselves to split the voters in two. I mean, if we were going to choose a simple way to combine everybody's different politics into one, I think that I would choose the average mathematically, because the average reflects everyone's opinions. If you have an average, if somebody moves, the average moves. But this median, it throws out most of the info. It says we just want to split people. The people here could move way over there, and the median wouldn't move. Now, I'm giving this example not because I think it represents what's wrong with democracy, but just because it's so simple and it's so easy to see how this certain structure of rules gives you a certain predictable outcome just because that's the logic of it. That's not what was intended. This happens in democracy too, unfortunately. So I'm going to do my best to give you the 2-minute explanation of what's wrong with democracy. And you should go read Manker Olson if you want, the 200-page explanation. So there are about 200 million people in Brazil. I want you to imagine some law which would cost everyone in Brazil $1. It would cost every one of you $1. Now, this law, unfortunately, benefits certain special parties. There are 100 people in Brazil who, instead of losing $1 from this law, each make $1 million. What is the net social result of this law? 200 million people each lose $1. That's a loss of $200 million. 100 people each gain $1 million. That's a gain of $100 million. So this has a net social cost of 200 million minus 100 million. It's a $100 million loss for the country in a utilitarian sense. I guarantee you this law will pass. Every time. In fact, I kind of look at democracy as a system for passing laws like this. Why? Well, how can each of you, who this law costs $1, organize and agitate and be activists to stop this law? If you put 1 hour of your time into trying to stop this law, you are taking a shot at earning $1 an hour. Thrilling. But each of these 100 people, they make $1 million from this law. They'll be happy to spend many hours finding out who the people are who are most needed to pass this law, how to lobby for it effectively, how to market it and fool people. They'll be willing to spend hundreds of thousands to pass the law and still turn a profit. you would have to organize 1% of Brazil. You'd have to organize 2 million people to have the same interest in this law as each one of these people do. And the costs of organizing those people would outweigh every time the benefits of doing it. You could spread Austrian economics to 1 million people in Brazil, and you wouldn't change these basic incentives. So I'm going to argue that what we need are changes in the incentives of systems and not just education. And this is where my sort of original contribution to the field comes in. It is saying, if democracy is a bad product, why don't we have better products? What is it about the government industry that's different from the cell phone industry that makes it so we throw out our cell phones every 2 years, but government only advances occasionally? You know, if you look at government as an industry, it's not just bad, it's terrible, right? Like, even a company with bad customer service usually doesn't murder its customers or steal from them. I mean, it's bad. It's really bad. I think that there are two main characteristics of the industry that make it so anti-innovation. The first is the barrier to entry. A barrier to entry in an industry is, how hard is it to get into the industry? How hard is it to start a new firm? I can start a software company with this laptop. This is enough capital to start a software company. Unfortunately, every bit of land is claimed by some government, and they won't just let you take a little bit to experiment with. So the barrier to entry to the government industry is you basically have to win like a war, an election, or revolution just to start a new company. Like, that's a ridiculous barrier to entry for an entrepreneur. And barriers to entry are really important. I mean, the first MP3 players weren't made by Apple. They were made by small startups. It tends to be small groups of people who do new, really different things that turn into radical innovation. When you have a high barrier to entry, when it's really hard to enter an industry, you get mostly big companies because only they can afford these barriers. You don't get a lot of small groups trying new things. Let's compare countries by GDP to companies by revenue. The largest company is Royal Dutch Shell with about $460 million a year in revenue. That puts it as larger than about 16 of the 180 countries in the world and smaller than the other 164. So the biggest companies are much smaller than almost all countries. If you have an industry where all of the firms are ridiculously large, of course it doesn't innovate. The other problem with this industry is customer lock-in. And what I mean is, how hard is it for a prospective user of the product to switch from one company to the other? Because the easier it is for you to switch from one company to another, the harder each company will try to compete to get you. Because if they do a good job, better than their competitor, people will switch. But if it's very hard to switch, they have to not only do better than their competitor, they have to do way better than their competitor. Well, what's the cost of switching countries? Some countries don't let you leave. A lot of countries don't let you enter. You've got to leave your house. You've got to pack up your physical things and move them. You may have to learn a new language, find a new job. It's a huge cost. What happens when you have an industry where it's really hard to enter and it's hard for customers to switch? You get something like the operating system industry, where you get a new entry about every 10 years. Microsoft, Apple, Linux. And I'm saying that this has, people blame Windows being bad on Microsoft. What I'm saying is, it has nothing to do with what kind of person Bill Gates is, and it has nothing to do with what kinds of operating systems are possible. It's just that an operating system is a lot of work, and it comes with a lot of applications. And so in order to make a new one, you have to do the work of writing the new operating system. You need the new computer programs. You need people to get used to the new system. It's a lot of work. And people have trouble switching. They've already bought a whole lot of programs that work on the old system. They don't want to have to go buy a bunch of new programs for the new system. And so we get an industry that has little innovation, that has only a few large firms. Let's compare this to something like the web. You know, for any category of websites, almost any category, there are a ton of different firms. There are a lot of travel websites. There are a lot of photo sharing websites. There are a lot of pornographic websites. For every type of website, people try lots of different things. This is because you can make a new website just with a computer. Let's consider another Microsoft product, the Xbox. All right, the Xbox is a great product. A lot of people are very happy. You know, Microsoft Windows is been a running joke for 20 years. The Xbox is considered a great product. It comes from the same company, but in a more competitive industry, one that's easier to enter and where people switch what they use more often. And we've seen operating systems get more competitive lately. We've seen services for computers get better, not because, you know, Apple is trying to compete harder, but because more and more things have moved to the web, where your operating system doesn't matter, right? And when we have netbooks, where people say, it runs Linux, whatever, I don't care, you know, I can access my Gmail. So we see things changing not because of the people, not because of the possible technologies, but just the incentives in the industry. So if the problem is we have too many big companies in the government industry, we don't have startups, then the solution is we have to somehow add a startup sector for government. All right, how do we do a government startup which tries some radically different system like anarcho-capitalism? An election doesn't do it. The president can't throw out the entire Constitution. Secession, I mean, secession happens still, and it's good, but when you have a country seceding, it tends, again, to repeat something close to the old political system. I mean, it's a big group, smaller than it was before, and big groups don't try radically new things. War and revolution, you know, maybe if you had a bloody, violent revolution and took over, you could try something really different. You know, we don't have so many wars and revolutions anymore, and that's a really good thing, because most of our governments, even the bad ones, are not so bad that it's worth risking your life for, which is great, because they've gotten better. The old way of trying out a startup government used to be to go someplace unoccupied, to go to the frontier. Being American, I'm most familiar with the example of America. People didn't fix things by having a revolution in Europe or by getting together to try to change the government there. They ran away to a place where there were not entrenched elites, where they had a blank canvas to try something new. And of course the elites followed them and tried to control them, but that distance made that control much harder. They won, you know, they wouldn't have won the, you know, Southwest England Revolution. But they could win the American Revolution because of the distance. Unfortunately, we're out of frontier. Every single rock on the planet is claimed. If it's above the water at high tide, then it extends oil and fishing rights out 200 miles, and so some country has claimed it. So with this framework, the answer becomes obvious. We just need to reopen the frontier by building floating cities, city-states on the ocean. And the goal of this is to transform the entire government industry. The goal of this is not, let's get a bunch of people together who believe the right thing and go form one new society. It's not that at all. We're going to lower the barrier to entry to where maybe tens to hundreds of thousands of people, for a cost of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, could go try out a radically new system of government, where all you have to do to try out something really different is to get that number of people and that amount of money together, which is, you know, not easy to get tens to hundreds of millions, but it's a lot easier than what we have now. But the really interesting part to me is not just how seasteading lowers this barrier to entry, but how it reduces customer lock-in, how it makes it easier to switch providers. This is a picture of the Royal Caribbean Freedom of the Seas and the Empire State Building at the same scale. So this cruise ship, it moves around. It doesn't just move around like as a special, you know, once every century kind of thing. It moves around constantly, all the time. So on the ocean, you can build your city-states out of modular pieces that can be rearranged, where you could leave your country without leaving your house. Or we call it vote with your house. To slightly modify a quote of my dad's from Machinery of Freedom, a seastead city might declare an unpopular war one day, and the leaders would wake up the next morning and find that the only buildings left are the military barracks and the newspaper offices. Everyone else has floated 5 miles away to a city that's almost the same, because they were pretty happy with the rest of the political system, except that it has new leaders who aren't going to declare an unpopular war. And of course, in practice, you probably wouldn't even have to do this. There's a saying in chess that the threat is greater than the execution. When people have the freedom to leave easily, that forces those running the country to do a good job to keep people there. So this vision of seasteading is to lower the barrier to entry and lower the cost of switching which country you're in. The idea is to create Politics 2.0, lots of small government startups that are innovating and competing for customers and trying different things. It's to create a market for government. So we're not just running away and kind of hoping things will be different. Water is a fundamentally different medium than land. It has different characteristics that will lead to a different type of society. Okay, that was a quick version of kind of a big, crazy idea. Some of the implications. People tend to label libertarians or anyone who wants to go try a new society as utopian. There's nothing utopian about competitive government. I'm not saying that I know the best way to run a society. I'm just saying that if a lot of different groups try out their favorite ways of running a society, something's going to work better. This is very scientific. All I'm saying is let's apply the scientific method to government and do more experiments. I mean, it's a measure of just how bad the government industry is that the scientific method is like a radical innovation. You know, people are always going to argue about what rights we should have, about what goals a society should be designed for, but they're going to argue a lot less bitterly if everyone can have what they want. And they shouldn't have to argue about what works and what doesn't. They should try it and find out. The world is complicated, and we can't plan ahead of time what the best rules or institutions for societies are. All we can do is go out and experiment more and find things that work. The best way to change incentives is with technology. In the US in 1968, there was a movement called zero population growth. It said, oh no, overpopulation is coming. We must convince people to have less kids. Whether or not you agree with that logic, what actually made people have less kids was the birth control pill. It may seem roundabout to get freedom by building cities on the ocean. I mean, it does seem roundabout. But the idea is that if we invent a technology, it changes what is possible. And it changes what people do. And that's actually a much better way of changing the world than trying to go out and convince a lot of people to change their behavior. You make them change their behavior with different incentives. And if you come to accept this viewpoint, when you look at political debate, you're going to kind of see it as like a childish tug of war. Like people pulling really hard, fighting bitterly where they disagree the most and getting nowhere. It's like the most work for the least results. I want to find ways where we can pull sideways on this rope. Do things that not convince people who really strongly believe that something else is the right way, that your way is best, but just gather the people who believe in your way and go out and do it. Space. One of the things that I find really exciting about this idea is that the same logic applies to space. Right now, space has a very high barrier to entry, but technology is bringing that down. And this whole mobility argument that I made about the ocean, where we can just switch countries really easily, it applies even more to space. You can move huge things around really, really cheaply. So the way I look at it is, you know, we built our civilization in the place that it was easiest at the beginning, and you know, we kind of screwed up. And maybe it was the best at the beginning, but the static arrangement of different countries has kind of trapped us. And with this static arrangement, centralized power tends to spread itself out and control things. But 68% of the Earth's surface is the oceans, and almost all of the universe has this quality of greater mobility. So, you know, we build our civilization so far in the wrong place, but most of the world has the right characteristics for a free, dynamic society. All right, before I talk about the things that my organization is doing to try to bring this ambitious goal to reality, I just want to talk about libertarianism and kind of normal libertarian activism and how it's different from this. So this set of answers is very different from the ones that I think most libertarians use. A question that I often use with non-libertarian groups is I say, why do we get better service at Starbucks than the DMV? Which in the US is the department that licenses your cars and says who can drive cars. Long lines, bad service. And a libertarian, if I pose this question, will just say, well, of course it's obvious. You know, Starbucks serves coffee. It's owned by an entrepreneur. He has profit or loss. The government employees at the DMV, they have no personal profit. But that's not the answer, I think. That's not the end of the answer. It's true, but it's incomplete. Why, I want to know, why do we have a good set of incentives at Starbucks? And why do we have a bad set of incentives for the government? I mean, after all, in a libertarian world, you know, one answer that libertarians might give is because the government uses force. Very standard answer. And therefore, bad things happen. But that's just not the answer. In a libertarian world, Starbucks might have a sign above the door that says, we, Starbucks, have a monopoly on the use of force inside this Starbucks. If you enter, you consent. They could do that, but I predict that if that happened, when people walked into Starbucks, the person serving coffee would not ask you to fill out a form stating your income for the year and ask you for part of it. Why? Because nobody would go to that Starbucks. And if every single Starbucks did this, someone would start a new one that just sold the damn coffee and didn't ask you what your income was or try to take some of it. So I hope to convince libertarians that even though incentives matter, that we often look at things at the wrong level. And we have to push our analysis up to these root causes. Why is the bad incentive structure in place? Now, if markets are the answer, if we need more competition between governments and more innovation in governments, and we love markets, why is it that libertarians don't come up with this answer very often? And my belief is that it comes from our past in small hunter-gatherer tribes, like many of our different mistakes that we consistently make. Tens of thousands of years ago, if we were sitting around the fire saying, you know, how should we divide up the buffalo meat, or where should we move for the summer, the way to change what the tribe did was to come up with a good idea, to articulate it persuasively, to go talk to some individuals and build a coalition of people around this idea. And in a group of 100 people, an individual can do this and change what the tribe does. But what works for 100 people doesn't necessarily work for 100 million. We have these same instincts that each of us has a voice in politics as big as a member of a 100-person tribe. So we comment on nationwide events that we have no influence over with this passion as if we were part of the tribe making the decision, even if nobody is listening. This, by the way, is my explanation for why there are so many blogs. So we have to move beyond this kind of intuitive activism that says politics is the process of reaching people individually and changing their minds and building coalitions. I mean, think about it. If somebody just said to you, okay, there's some industry and it's got a monopoly provider, which makes a really bad product. Here's 2 ways you could fix it. You could fill out their customer surveys and say how crappy they are. You could write a lot of letters to their customer service department. You could try to form a group of reformers and agitate for the monopoly to do a better job. Or you could compete with the monopoly. I think a libertarian every time would say, well, of course, competition is better. So why is it that we don't compete with governments? I mean, I think part of the reason is that complaining is a lot easier. It's a lot easier. But do we want to do what's easy, or do we want to do what works? I mean, I kind of think of my mission as kind of like convincing people to stop looking for the fountain of youth and start doing anti-aging scientific research as a way of extending lifespan. It doesn't make it easy, at least it makes it possible. Unfortunately, libertarians tend to see the way to reform as being convince everyone of libertarianism. And it makes me very frustrated. This is kind of how I feel about this. Yes, it's very sad. And maybe this is a hard message to sell right now when libertarian groups are increasing in popularity. I mean, Ron Paul was this huge force for the libertarian movement in the US. But even though he did far better than libertarians have seen for a long time, he got 5.5% of the popular vote in the primary and ended up with 15 delegates, less than 1% of the total. Now, some people say, okay, but it's a great start. We just have to try harder and speak louder. Unfortunately, studies suggest that there's actually a libertarian personality. So David Nolan, who created the Nolan chart here, says that maybe 16%, 1/6 of the people are natural libertarians. Other studies using more restrictive definitions, like from David Bowes from the Cato Institute, say maybe it's 6% of people. And you might think that you can convince people that your morality is right, that freedom is correct. But the latest psychological research on morality from people like Jonathan Haidt suggests that morality is actually this kind of innate thing, that people have snap moral answers, and that all of the logic they make about moral rules is just made up after the fact to justify their snap answer. So there are definitely people that you can convert to libertarianism by arguing with them, but I think it's a very limited number of people. And when libertarianism spreads, I think that most of what's happening is not convincing people, but people who had not identified before as libertarian kind of realizing that there's this whole coherent philosophy and that there's evidence and there's groups of people for this way that they felt before and identifying with this group. And that's really valuable. That's really important, but it's not enough. But actually, I'll give you another argument and say it's even worse. Even if we could convince many people to be libertarians, we still would not win elections. H.L. Mencken has this great quote, "Every election is a sort of advance auction sale of stolen goods." And that's the sort of structural model of democracy. In the old model, it's like democracy is about giving people what they want. And you change what people want, and democracy will give them different things. But in this Mencken view, democracy, the people who compete in elections, the resources that they use to compete are those that they're going to seize control of if they win. So people who will use the resources and hand them out to their friends end up with many more friends, end up with many more supporters. So even if we convinced many libertarians, libertarians not only are a minority, but they underperform their numbers in elections because they're not promising to give out goodies. There's a strong overlap between libertarianism and academia. And I think that's part of why there's a bias that says we just have to be right. We have to understand the world, we have to be right, we have to explain it, and that's enough. But politics is not a mechanism for discovering the truth and turning it into law. And so what we need is better mechanisms. What we need is more examples of free societies to convince people and ways that the people who are already convinced can go have a free society, not more papers and research. I mean, if you write the 532nd paper about Austrian business cycle theory, nobody's going to read it but the Austrians. If you go and create a society with 10,000 people that uses a different financial system and that has a stable economy over a long period of time with no booms and busts, the whole world will listen. Yes, this is much, much harder, but it can actually work. There's a classic economic mistake, which is to think that you can set prices with no consequence, to not understand that prices emerge from the intersection of supply and demand, that they're the result of human action, not human design. Well, in my view of things, when someone proposes a better law or a better policy, they're kind of policy fixing, like price fixing. They're making the same mistake. They're assuming we don't have a good law because the government doesn't have enough economists on staff, or because nobody suggested a really great way to achieve these stated goals. The problem is democracy is not a machine for spitting out good policies. There are underlying incentives, like the rewarding of special interests that I mentioned, that make government pass bad laws. We have to change the incentives if we're going to change this. There's a lot of divisiveness in the libertarian movement considering how small it is. I've heard anarchists say, you know what, we can't cooperate with minarchists. Because at the end of the day, if they get a minarchy, if they get a small state and we want to have our anarchy, they're going to be pointing guns at our head and saying, you got to use our small central government. But the idea of seasteading, the idea that groups should be free to band together in voluntary communities to try out new systems, is truly big tent, right? We can all agree that this would be a good thing. Even communists can agree that this would be a good thing. Because, hey, they think that their system would work great and that they'll be able to get lots of people to come do it. We think that our system would be great. We get lots of people to come do it. We can all agree. More experimentation, more political autonomy is a good thing. I have a little bit of family history in this world of politics and political activism. This is a quote that Brian Doherty wrote about my grandfather Milton, that the beauty of America is, may I advocate classical liberal limited government so that my son, who's here, David, may advocate anarcho-capitalism, and that my grandson, myself, may plan to build new artificial countries in the ocean. And I think that there's some real truth to this as a series of evolved ideas, where we all want the same thing but are trying different strategies. So my grandfather talked a lot about policies, right? Here is a good policy, and let me persuasively try to argue why this is a good policy. He changed many people's minds and still continues to do so, but we still have big government. Maybe he slowed the growth, but it still growed. My dad said, maybe the problem comes from the incentives, not from people's beliefs. And he'll be speaking at 6:30 about a different system than democracy, called anarcho-capitalism, and why its incentives might produce better laws. Now I come along and say, great, I'm convinced. This anarcho-capitalism thing sounds like a great idea. Why are great ideas for new systems of government not being tried? How can we change the world so that these great ideas can be tried? Now, given that I'm talking about the problems with organizing into political groups to try to change things, I want to clarify that I'm not saying libertarians shouldn't organize and network and try to convince people of our goals. I'm only saying that that's not enough. I mean, I wouldn't be here talking to you about seasteading if there was not this great new organization, Mises Brazil, getting people together. Any kind of reform, even if it's the kind that I advocate, structural reform, changes incentives, is going to happen because people go out there and spread the word, get a group of people together who agree about it, convince them, and then go do it. So organization is important. What I'm saying is most of the benefits of organizing into groups are not that those groups will somehow eventually take over the world, right? Most of the benefit of the Libertarian Party of Brazil is not that they will eventually conquer Brasilia. The benefit is, by joining this group, you get to signal your beliefs, you get to ally with people who share your philosophy, you get to spend time debating with them and learning with them and from them, and feeling not alone in the world. I mean, this is really important. This is really valuable. But most of the gains are private gains to that group of people, and not that these groups will grow and grow and grow to the point where they take over the world. And, you know, this is not just a belief that I have. For example, David Nolan, who founded the Libertarian Party in the United States, says the same thing, says that he views it more as a social group than as a political party that will eventually someday win in elections. All right, so that was the ideas, and now I'm going to zoom way, way, way down to the Seasteading Institute, the organization I founded, and our concrete projects to do this. All right, so here's what we've done. We were founded in 2008 with $500,000 of funding from PayPal founder Peter Thiel and first investor in Facebook. We got nonprofit status in the United States. This was actually a little bit of a fight. For July 4th last year, our political blog, Let 1,000 Nations Bloom, celebrated Secession Week because it's the anniversary of when the United States seceded from Britain in the American Revolution. We had a week of posts all about secession. This was the week the IRS looked at our website, the tax authority in the U.S. that grants tax-exempt status, and they wrote us a letter that said, how is advocating illegal tax evasion and secession a charitable purpose? And we, politely explained that there was nothing illegal about advocating for peaceful secession, that we were, linking to reputable publications like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times where these issues were being discussed, and they ceded and got us our status. One of the biggest challenges of floating cities, as you might imagine, is engineering, and that's where a lot of our work is. We've been working on kind of an overview of all of the engineering issues, trying to figure out what the challenges are and what designs are best. It's published on our website as a rough draft right now. We've done one detailed design for a 200-guest hotel resort, size for the waves off Los Angeles. It's about $120 million, or $300 a square foot, and we hope to bring this price down with future research. We did a design contest, which was kind of neat. We started with the skeleton that our engineers had designed, and then let architects put whatever they could imagine on top. So it was sort of a fusion of practicality and aesthetics. This is the overall winner, The Swimming City. This was the best picture, Oasis of the Seas. This won the Aesthetics Award. It was a self-sustained seastead. And Brazil's own Anthony Ling won the Personality Award for rendering freedom. You'll note that this design has the best understanding of the ideas of seasteading. I don't know if you can see, but every apartment unit here is sort of a modular shipping container, and they're cranes, so that even if the seastead cities are the size of this platform, you could move your home from one to the other very easily. There's been a ton of press interest in what we're doing. In 2009, someone Googled for seasteading every 12 minutes. We throw conferences. Last year we had 19 speakers and 75 people, not as many as Mises Brazil. We've got some competition. People spoke about engineering designs, business models, international law of the sea, all kinds of things. All the videos are on our website. We've inspired people around the world. There's a seasteading startup in Florida trying to build a seastead for tourism. There's one in Singapore building fish farms. And I know of at least 4 theses that are being written already on seasteading academically. There's ocean engineering and legal theses in Spain. There's a master's in documentary at Stanford. And for a master's in film writing, someone's doing a pilot for a television series based on seasteading as science fiction. We recently held our first ever floating festival that we call Ephemerile in a river in California. Unlike most of what we do in the office, this had the benefit of actually building stuff on the water, fully engaging with the realities. This was my beginning to the event. This was my home-built pirate raft partway along the journey before I got bored and tried to climb up the side and capsized it, thus definitely engaging with the water. This was the main built half of the festival. There was also a large group of houseboats. And the idea of Ephemerile is building a new country in international waters is really, really hard. Easier than winning in a democracy, but very hard. What if we can chop it down on every dimension? Less people, less time, less freedom. So the first year we did it on a river in California, and it's going to move out every year to more and more autonomous zones until eventually it's a temporary festival in international waters where people have legal autonomy. And then our hope is for it to happen more often throughout the year, to get longer and longer each year until eventually perhaps it's a permanent way of life. That's some of what we've done. What we're doing now, making a bigger and better ephemeral. There are a number of differences. The one I'm most excited about is that last year there was just one cluster, which is not really the idea of seasteading. This year, while we'll still be in California waters, we're going to have 5 to 10 different independent islands, each of which has different rules about how loud your music can be, whether you can show corporate logos, whether guns are allowed, whether you can have alcohol, whether you're allowed to wear clothes or have to wear clothes. So it's going to be a much better realization of the ideas of seasteading, a bunch of different communities trying different things. I'm writing a book. This is actually a book I wrote about 7 years ago. You can see it's really detailed, all kinds of little bits. I'm writing a new book for a wider audience this year. We're working on exploring business ideas. The first one is doing cosmetic surgery on cruise ships. The idea is people already fly to other countries for cheaper medical procedures. If you're an American, why fly to India or Thailand or Brazil when you could get on a cruise ship out of San Diego or Florida? And we're working on our kind of medium-term strategy for how to build the first real autonomous seastead on the ocean by 2015 for 50 people. It's been kind of a struggle taking this big long-term vision and turning it into concrete steps. And we found that this kind of 6-year goal is really important. It's kind of long enough that we think we can do something really meaningful, but yet short enough that we can make much more detailed plans, Gantt charts, if you know what those are, as compared to the big goal of seasteading. Like any humans, our wants exceed our resources. So here are the kind of logical next steps that we'd like to do if we had the funding. Do a location survey. People always ask us, where would you build a seastead? We have some ideas, but we need to hire an oceanographer and political boundary researchers to study the best places in the world, hire an engineer, and we have a number of contests that we'd like to run, like last year's design contest. So if you're interested in dreaming of a better world and trying to figure out how to make it, check out our websites. Seasteading.org is the main one, and our political blog, Let 1,000 Nations Bloom, is at 1000nations.com. Thank you.